Buenas tardes. Vamos a empezar este panel. Quería agradecer a la feria por la invitación. Mi nombre es João Mourao. Con Luis hemos curado la sección de la Baco Sur. Vamos a empezar el panel con un vídeo que ha sido un poco la inspiración para lo que se puede ver ahí para esta conversa.
I'm not going to try to speak Spanish because it's a disaster, so I'm just going to use English. I apologize for that. As João mentioned, that was a very early starting point for thinking about what this edition of ZsONAMACO could be. And we were very interested in the idea of rhythm in connection to artistic practice. Not only as an actual tool in terms of how artists use rhythm in their work, but also as a metaphor to deal with, in this specific situation, what is in the section, and you can see. As part of the project, which is called Case Study Number 2, Rhythm is a Dancer, we thought of it with the solo projects, which deal with this very expanded notion of rhythm, and simultaneously the panel, which is also titled Case Study Number 2, Rhythm is a Dancer, and through which we will try to think a bit about how rhythm feeds or not into curatorial practice. And for that reason, we've invited a series of curators, like-minded people, colleagues, to present how rhythm is or isn't part of their practice as curators. And I think that is probably the most interesting part of this panel. So João is going to introduce them, and they will each present something very special with us.
Okay, so we'll start with Yilmaz, and the last name being Dziewor. Okay, I'm going to say it better. He's the director of the Ludwig Museum in Cologne, so we're going to talk about Yvonne Reinen, especially. So if you want to come here, or going to say the image. Okay, I can pick that.
Why don't you introduce everyone first? No? Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, João and Luis, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. It's, I think, the third or fourth time I'm in Mexico, and I always enjoy it a lot. When I got the invitation from you both, I was actually right away quite excited, and I did not think much about before I said yes. Then later on, when I thought more about the title of your presentation here, the exhibition, and congratulations, I went through, and I think it really brings this thematic topic of rhythm on different layers, makes it visible. I was maybe more plain by choosing Yvonne Rainer for this presentation, because of course with her it's obvious how rhythm, or that rhythm is a crucial part of her work. But when you were talking about rhythm, I was also, and using rhythm as a metaphor, I was interested in this because as rhythm also structures the system, and not only like the music system, but also I would say you can use it as a metaphor for any system, also the system we are working in, the art system, and that's something I guess all of us is permanently conscious about, how this system, how the art system works, and how you position yourself in the context of this system. And for me, in this context, it was always important in my work to also work with people who are not necessarily in the center of the system, but to approach the system from different angles. This is one point I would say I reflect the institution, the art institution as such, with my work, with working from people who are not right in the center of the system, but more from the fringe. But also that by analyzing the system with projects, I worked before at the Kunstverein, and maybe just a few words about the German system, which is, I guess, very different from the American or also from the French system. We have, so to say, three different art institutions in a way. There's one is the Kunstverein, which is an institution, usually the oldest art institutions in the German art system. They were developed as part of the Enlightenment to sort of like educate the people in the 19th century, early 19th century, and they had a strong also social and even political aspect in their work, in the bringing the art across the people. Then that is, as I said, an old institution, but at the same time, these are always the institutions who work sort of like with the youngest artists, or who work, and I'm making it easy now, but to work with more experimental formats. You would more expect an experimental format in a Kunstverein than you would do with the two other systems we have, like the Kunsthalle, which is similar to the Kunstverein, not an institution with a collection, an opposite to the museum, but which changing exhibition. And then we have the museums to work with who are strongly identified by their collections. So these are, what the three main institutions in Germany are. And I was lucky, I was working in all three institutions. I worked with the Kunstverein in Hamburg. Then later on I worked with the Kunsthalle, though it's called Kunsthaus in Bregenz. And now since 1 year I'm at the Museum Ludwig in Cologne. And for me it's interesting, or for me it's a topic to think, there are these different characterizations I was just explaining. But for me, it's always crucial, and especially now, since 1 year, I'm at the Museum Ludwig, which is a big museum, which has a vast collection, one of the biggest collections of pop art, for example, worldwide. I think the third biggest Picasso collection worldwide. So it's really a massive institution. With all the plus, but of course also with all the negative would be too much, but maybe with all the constraint an institution like this brings with. And so in all three formats I was always concerned, how to question the logic of these institutions and how to deal with the parameters the institution per se gives. And and I've chosen Yvonne Rainer now on the one hand because of the, as she fits so well into this topic of rhythm, but at the same time, for me it was interesting that that I worked with Yvonne Rainer in the two different contexts. One at the Kunsthalle, at the Kunsthaus Bregenz, and the images you will see here are from the Kunsthaus Bregenz. And I also already cooperated without knowing that once I would be the director of this institution with the Museum Ludwig, with my colleague Barbara Engelbach from the Museum Ludwig. So, and I thought it's also interesting to see, maybe to contradict myself, with the 3 parameters I just made, to show that we, with a position like Yvonne Rainer, who comes from dance, who is a choreographer, who I guess most of you know was very influential in the 60s and 70s with her choreography. And for example, a lot of visual artists work together with her. She herself describes herself or identifies, I think, very strongly as a choreographer, as a dancer, and not as a visual artist. But we invited her to the Kunsthaus and then cooperated with the Museum Ludwig in Cologne because she's crucial for certain debates in her time which were important from our point of view, important debates in the contemporary art. And to name only maybe a few is how to deal, for example, with spectacle. And we're talking here when she did the first works around the 60s, 1960s. So when the idea of the spectacle was very crucial in the debate also of the contemporary art. So, and she deals with this by sort of like neglecting the spectacle, but to bring everyday movements or everyday rhythms, you could say, everyday movements into the dance, and works quite opposite of to the classical dance. But coming back to the system, for us it was interesting, for Barbara Engelbach and me, it was interesting when we invited Yvonne Rainer. Her reaction first was that she was still insisting that she is not a visual artist, that she is interested in showing in this context, but insisting she's not a visual artist. And then for us there were the challenge how to present her work in the context of an institution with visual arts. And when we go once back, So what we did then at the Kunsthaus and later similar in Cologne at the Museum Ludwig, what we did, we projected 2 of her recent, that was she asking for, 2 of her recent dance she developed. And as you could see here, it was almost that you could see it like on the stage, and we presented it in big black boxes so you could be aware of it. At the same time, it's obvious that it can't, you have to have, it's only like a second image. It's not the real thing which has an end and a beginning and an end. It has this atmosphere of liveness, which is for dance, I think, so important. And these questions we did not solve with this presentation. I mean, this is the first floor with this presentation, but it was a mean to at least to show her work. And then on the second floor, we worked with Barbara Engelbach. I spent some weeks at the Getty Archive in Los Angeles. She gave all her archive material, Yvonne Rainer, to the Getty Archive, and that's how we helped ourselves in the exhibition. We presented photos and we presented posters, invitation cards, all the archival material. And again, you see, we also on small monitors we presented the certain actions and certain performances she did. And as most of you know, Yvonne Rainer is not only a choreographer and a dancer, but in the 80s was very much involved in film, experimental film. And so on the third floor we These are just more images. And yeah, but maybe we go first to the third floor. Okay, and on the third floor we were showing all her, she did 8 films, and we're showing all the films of her on separate screens, so you could sit down and watch every film she did. And then when you continue further, yeah, and there you could also see, like almost like in a cinema, as a big projection, and you could choose which film you want to watch. Having said this, of course there are, for me at least, a lot of question marks. How to. It left a lot of questions open for me, this presentation, because I think that our audience, they, after seeing the show, of course, they knew much more about Yvonne Rainer, and they got a lot of information, and I think they got the different facades of her artistic practice through going through the exhibition. But at the same time, and that was also an interesting experience for me working with her, she was insisting, or maybe I say a bit the development. When we first approached her, she was sort of like skeptical and said, I'm not a visual artist, I'm a choreographer and dancer. Why do you want to do this show? So we convinced her and told her about the importance for us and for our practice, and also for certain younger artists up to now of her practice. So she then said, okay, and I like to be involved, she said. But then, as we continued and we informed her, at one point she said, I don't have to decide how you present the work, because you are the curators and I trust you, so you do the things. But what she was insisting on, and I thought that was also interesting, she said, for her it's less crucial how the exhibition looks, but for her it was really crucial how to present her 2 newest pieces she did for this. And this, if we go back, she one further, yeah. So we presented at the theater in Bregenz, which is a really small city. We presented her newest dance, and then if you go back again, yeah, and one further, the one where, yeah, this. So and the other mean for us to to bring the practice of Yvonne Rainer across was that we offered. Yvonne Rainer was very generous. She did workshops for the local dance community, and local means then like people from Munich would come, people from Zurich, but also in Vorarlberg, the area where the Kunsthaus Bregenz is, there is quite a strong dance movement. So she would do workshops for them, and we would do, during the exhibition, we would have dance Trio A, which is one of her most famous pieces. Local dancer would then perform in a regular time, would perform then the dance. And so and for me, and I think we're supposed to talk each 10 minutes or something around, and for me that was sort of like one highlight, also that Yvonne Rainer herself was dancing Trio A, but quite characteristically for her, and if you think back about that, she is against the spectacle, and that she tries to bring the everyday movement into the space. She did this just as I guess as a thank you to me and some colleagues, like almost even quite spontaneously. She danced Trio A then in the exhibition, and my colleague did the photos of it, and that was something, I think, for me, a very important experience. But I think with the performances we showed in the theater, and with the workshops we did, and with the then the performances during the exhibition, I think with all the problems you have to working in the different fields, I think my colleagues and I were quite successful. just before stopping now, one thing for me was then also interesting how the Museum Ludwig then would deal with these issues. So they did the same exhibition in the sense of like the same material was there. They also, because that was such a strong wish of Yvonne Rainer, they did show the newest performances she did then, but they also invited Heimut Zobernick, an Austrian artist who reflects with his practice the institution as such. They invited him to do a crucial part of the exhibition setting, an installation which on a metaphorical way analyzes the idea of movement. So I thought it was interesting that the museum invited an extra artist to do the setting, to deal with the question, how to present a format or how to present a practice, usually not necessarily found in the museum. Thank you. Yeah, it was 2012. Yeah.
Thank you. Moving on, next we have Adrienne Drake, and Adrienne Drake is the director of the Giuliani Foundation in Rome. And do you want to switch places with me? Yes. Yours is this one.
Wow. Hello, and thanks very much for being here, and thank you both for the invitation. So, I'm the director of the Fondazione Giuliani in Rome, and we are a small, independent, private, non-profit foundation opened in 2010 by two collectors of contemporary art. And when thinking about the subject matter, rhythm, and thinking about how it relates to my curatorial practice, I was sort of thinking in relation, in particular, to the foundation. I am more aligned in some ways to the idea of time, perhaps, than to movement. We only do 3 exhibitions a year, and each of those exhibitions last about 3 months. And that was a very conscious decision on my part to sort of embrace slowness as a curatorial approach, and to embrace the sort of slowing down and sort of create an institutional pace around slowness, which I suppose also very nicely, coincidentally, occurs also with our very small exhibition budget. So that's not by chance, perhaps also. These are just some installation shots from various exhibitions that we've done. So this, I actually suppose I should talk about. This is the first exhibition that I actually made for the opening of the foundation, called Mutiny Seemed a Probability, based on idea of the sort of the fragility of contemporary sculpture. And this is an exhibition by Ahmet Agut, the Turkish artist. And the sort of focus of the foundation, to a certain extent, are on solo exhibitions, although I do some group shows, but they're primarily solo exhibitions. This is an exhibition that I invited Ahmet Agut to work with the foundation's collection, and basically gave him sort of carte blanche to work with the collection in any way he wanted. So his exhibition was an integration of works of his own with a selection of works from the collection. And if you can see, I'm not sure if you can see, but kind of in the very back, there's a work by Michel Cantor, which is a pair of Armani jeans with stinging nettles in the pockets. And so Ahmet kind of created a whole sort of hanging laundry. This is a work by Carl Andre, in which he completed the square. This is a solo show by Simon de Buurmuller, in which we created a space. Roman Publications. This is an exhibition that I co-curated with Luis and João, called Beauty Codes. It was a 3-part project in Cura Basement in Rome, and in Kunsthal Lissabon, and in Fondazione Giuliani. And when I do solo exhibitions in the foundation, when possible, we always try to commission new works for the exhibitions. And this is a private performance that German artist Nora Schulz made in the foundation, creating a work that was then installed in the show. And I think one of the reasons why it's important to me that we produce new works for each exhibition is because we have a sort of an interesting, rather large but very idiosyncratic exhibition space that basically doesn't change. So what I try to do with the exhibitions is to create sort of a different experience for the viewer every time they come to an exhibition, as curators all do in a way. And so I sort of try to create a kind of different sense of rhythm every time someone is in an exhibition, and artists who are producing new works, particularly in the foundation, seem to have that kind of ability sometimes to kind of create different pathways and create different viewer experiences. We also did an exhibition with Oscar Touzan, and this is an Oscar with one of our colleagues making one of the works for the show. This is Oscar with his children. Speaking of sort of rhythm in the art world, Oscar Touzan has this really amazing kind of rhythm to his own making, in a way. He would come to the foundation every single day at 9 in the morning, and every day at noon his family would arrive and they'd go to lunch together, and they would come back, and he would work until 6 and then he'd leave. And it was a really sort of beautiful experience working with him, because it really created a different sense of pacing, in a way, and a different sense of priority and experience. And inevitably, when his children would arrive, he would be sort of buried in concrete, lying on the ground, sort of creating something, and they would all sort of throw themselves on him and sort of drag him away. So this is an image of that. We also did an exhibition with Benoit Maire in collaboration with Vincent Honoré from the David Roberts Art Foundation. And this was also a way of thinking about how to manipulate and change an exhibition space, and how to change the viewer's experience when they're walking through the space. What you don't see here is that there were different lighting systems for different areas of the exhibition space, but a piece that he did produce for the show was a piece that basically consisted of about 17 or 18 different elements, and every 2 weeks he would send us instructions, and we would have to reformulate these pieces into different sculptural formations. So if you see this sort of yellow piece of plexiglass, this is another piece. Then 2 weeks later it would be somewhere else, and then another 2 weeks later we would have different pieces, and it was a way to sort of activate the space and activate the exhibition, and sort of change your perception as you were walking through it, if you continue to come back and see the exhibition over time. Which, of course, having such a long duration for each of the exhibitions is sort of a priority for me. I think working in Rome, where we're rather off-center, it's important to create these possibilities for contemporary art. It's important to create different possibilities for engaging as much as possible with the public. And Rome can also be interesting because you need to be spontaneous. You can make things up. You kind of need to surrender to the improvised in a lot of ways. So something else that I also sort of try to do, or we try to do, is when thinking about inviting an artist, or when thinking about doing an exhibition with an artist, it's important to me that sometimes there's an opportunity to kind of look at more tangential aspects of the artist's practice. So again, going back to Oscar Touzan, Oscar is a pretty wonderful writer, and he's also a very good exhibition organizer. And rather than inviting him to do a solo exhibition purely of his own work, I invited him to organize an exhibition that sort of talked about the way he creates work, or to talk about influences by and from other artists. So he created an exhibition, basically a group show, different artists, different aspects. This is a ceremonial mask by a mask maker in Washington State called Bodic. And these are actual ceremonial masks that are used in Native American ceremonial practices. This is a replica of a sculpture by Scott Burton, and in the far end you can see a small table by Scott Burton. And the show was entitled Scott Burton because in the moment when I invited Oscar to do the show, he himself was self-described as being absolutely obsessed with Scott Burton. And so this whole exhibition is sort of him thinking about his own making, his own artistic practice, through the eyes of wishing to be an artist like Scott Burton. Peter Fend was also in the show. We also recently did an exhibition with an American artist called Jay Hikes. And Jay Hikes is from Minneapolis. And he has a very sort of a small group of very, very close friends who are all artists and with whom they often collaborate together. And so I invited him to make an exhibition sort of highlighting this aspect of collaboration and highlighting this aspect of sort of artists kind of coming together spontaneously, working together, making pieces together, making shows together. Again, because this was an interesting aspect of his own practice, but also because for me it was an important lesson, is entirely too sanctimonious, but it was an important possibility of thinking about how to make work in a city like Rome, because Rome is a very particular and difficult city where collaboration can be quite complicated. So this is a piece that basically consists of an item of clothing from every artist in the exhibition, called Frankenstein, or My Frankenstein. This is a single work by Jay Hikes called Family Tree, which was sort of the embodiment of the sort of the precept of the show, sort of thinking about a family tree as a sort of a loose concept of family, and how this family tree were basically this sort of close-knit group of artists that he worked with. And these are other pieces in the show, Getty Siboni and Todd Norston. And we just very, very, very recently, yesterday, opened an exhibition of the Italian artist Giorgio Griffa. And this is an exhibition that is part of a 4-part project with other institutions, 3 other institutions. And again, sort of trying to think about how to create a possibility for thinking about artists in different ways. The exhibition in the foundation, which is guest curated by Andrea Bellini from the Centro Contemporáneo in Geneva, are entirely works on paper. And it's the first time that his works on paper have ever been on display, because they've never been considered, he'd never considered them as something to be exhibited before. So unfortunately I don't have images because we opened yesterday, but these are just some examples of his works on paper. And that's it.
Yes, it's you. Thank you, Adrienne. Next we have Anders Keuger, and Anders is a curator at MUCA in Antwerp, and he will be the next. Should I put the video on while you...
Maybe I'll switch with it.
Just fine.
Okay, there. Thank you. Hello, and thank you for having me here. It's very nice to be here and speak to you. Rhythm, that was the theme. And then I thought, rhythm doesn't always have to be dance, right? It could be, but it doesn't have to be. It also doesn't have to be music. Indeed, it even doesn't have to be visible or graspable. It can be so slow that you don't even think of it as rhythm because you never really experience it as such. but it's still rhythm somehow. I am going to just let something play in the background, while I am speaking, and I'm going to explain it to you in a moment. Yeah. Okay, fine, thank you. I am the curator, one of the curators in a museum called MUCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art Antwerp, in Belgium. And we are a museum funded by the Flemish community. As you may know, Belgium is basically not one country but several, and one of them is Flanders. And Flanders wants to have its own Museum of Contemporary Art, the government. So it does, since 30 years. And we are a museum, which means that, as Yilmaz was explaining, we have a collection. That is one of the things that makes a museum special. We do organize exhibitions as well, different kinds of exhibitions. But in recent years, we have been thinking about other ways in which we as a museum can be special and different from other kinds of art institutions, not only by having a collection. One of the ways that we are really busy thinking about and even writing a formal plan about, because no other museum in Belgium has done this, is the whole concept of research. You may know that the International Committee on Museums, ICOM, has formulated 4 criteria or described 4 activities that define the work of museums. And one is acquisition, to acquire work for the collection. The second one is conservation in all its aspects. The third is research, that you have objects and you have to know what they are and you have to do research. And then the research feeds into number 4, which is presentation. So thinking about what research can be in the museum, we end up trying also to define what it is not, in the sense of what it is, what research is in a museum that it is not for an artist, for example, or for an independent curator, or for a writer, or for a critic. We don't really know exactly what that is, that makes museum research specific. But one aspect of being a museum curator and actively doing research that I personally feel very strongly about and think is very important is the opportunity to work very closely with artists as they are developing new thoughts, new ideas, and new work. It is not only about producing new work, it's not only about facilitating the presentation of new work, but it's also about having the privilege, I would say, of being close to an artist when she or he actually thinks and makes the work. I have previously in my practice thought a lot about mediation and how it often takes over other aspects of working within the art field. And I was trying for a number of years to replace the idea of mediating something with the idea of thinking together. Thinking together with the artist, thinking together with the institution, and thinking together with the audience. And this particular kind of research that I'm talking about now, which is working together with artists, is also thinking together with artists. I do it as a curator in the museum, but I also want the audience eventually to be part of that process. And we are doing different kinds of exhibitions, but one particular format that we are very interested in is the format that allows us to do more than an exhibition. Not just an exhibition in terms of just putting up work, but something that also engages the society around us in different ways. It allows people to be more engaged and involved in what we are trying to do as a museum. So we do exhibitions that are a bit more experimental once in a while, maybe once a year, maybe not that often, but for the time being, because the museum is also part of a confederacy of museums in Europe, which is called L'International, and involves, for instance, 2 big museums in Spain, the MAGBA in Barcelona and the Reina Sofia in Madrid. Because of this, we have some funding from the European Union that makes it possible for us to do practically one more experimental exhibition every year. next year, in 2017, I am beginning now to work on a project which is called a Temporary Institute of Futures Studies. And the S after future, the plural S, is important. What we are doing is we are working together with a professional futurist, Maya van Leemput, who is a Flemish futurist working in Brussels in a university there, and also quite active as an expert for the European Union in different projects that they do, which are to do with social innovation, trying to think the future in different ways. So together with Maya, I am thinking about how we can do more than an exhibition around a theme that engages many people, which is how do we think the future, how do we imagine the future, and how do we go from future to futures? How do we feel in our practice the plurality of the future? So we came up with this idea of turning the museum temporarily into an institute of futures studies. And this means two things. It means making programming for the museum. An exhibition is part of it, but there will also be other things happening. And it means organizing a worldwide conference of future studies in Belgium in 2017. And for the first time, the three major organizations in this particular field, future studies, will come together and do one conference. And there's one organization which is more academic. There's another which unites mostly North American professional commercial forecasting people, foresight forecasting. And there is a third one which is a more popularizing educational organization. And they're all agreeing now to come together and do this conference, which will also at least partly take place in the museum. So there's already more than an exhibition. The exhibition itself will be based on 4 different ways of modeling futures that have been thought up and partly put into practice by Professor Jim Dater of the University of Hawaii in Honolulu. So it's called the Hawaii School of Future Studies. And he's a mathematician. He's now quite old. And because he's a mathematician, he's interested in how things relate to each other in unpredictable and yet systematic ways. So we came up with a 4-part system of how to imagine futures and how to think futures. The first one is continuity. The future is basically more of the same. It looks almost like the present or the past. It is the future, but it's continuous. The second one is collapse. Everything will collapse. We will relive the scenario of the collapse of the Roman Empire when the Swedes came in and cut off the hot water so they couldn't have their baths anymore, and everything collapsed. The fourth one is discipline, interestingly, because how does discipline relate to the 2 previous ones? Well, we are making a logical jump already. Discipline is interesting. The fourth one is transformation. What we are going to do is we're going to give tasks to people, 4 artists, who are each going to be given the task to imagine or represent one of these 4 ways of thinking the future. We're also going to invite a politician, a technologist, a theorist, and a designer. We haven't quite decided yet who these people are. But I know one artist who would fit very well into the system. And that is the Lithuanian artist Darius Jura. And we are actually looking now at something quite interesting, which is a speeded up version of the first of 6 films. This one is made in 2001. The first of 6 films, where he goes to the village where he grew up in the north of the country in Lithuania and makes a 60-second video portrait of each and every inhabitant in the village. Obviously the people who happen to be there that particular day. Some people may be away and they're not obviously then taped that particular day. He did this for us now, and he cut the 60 seconds down to 10 seconds. But it still gives you an idea of what the work is about. People just looking into the camera. Some people doing it with ease, some people doing it more with more tension, and maybe some people not even managing to look into the camera, as you have seen. Now, he did this the first time in 2001, and this is the version we're seeing now. And then he went back to the same village in 2004, 2007, 2010, 2013, and he's going to do it this summer as well. Which means we have a series of works that cover the faces and realities through the faces and through the eyes of these people for a period of 15 years. And I am going to give the task to Darius, who is an artist I've worked with several times, to represent in this exhibition continuity, as you may already have guessed. And what we're going to do with this material is that we have a round space in the museum, and we have 6 different films, and they're shot on slightly different formats, so they will, when projected, have slightly different formats as well. And we're going to turn this work into a kind of clock, where you see the same person's face 6 times, looking into the camera for 60 seconds, and then the whole thing shifts, and you have the second person and the third and so on. And then obviously some people will have passed away in the meantime, and new people are born as well. Although the fertility rate in Lithuania is quite low, so I don't actually know how many new inhabitants of this village will have been added to the rooster. But you can already probably imagine this work as being quite, at least I do, imagine it as being quite powerful in the sense of giving a real illustration, in the good sense of the word illustration, which actually is the same as illumination, which in turn is the same as casting light upon something. We tend to think of illustration as a second-hand practice, where you already have a text that says everything, and then you ask somebody to read the text, imagine how it looks like, make a picture to help the reader imagine what he's reading. But this is not what I mean when I say illustration. I mean casting light on an idea. And I think that Darius will be able to do this within the framework of this exhibition, which will be more than an exhibition. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anders. Hello. It's working. Next, we have Elena Filipovic, and Elena is the director of the Kunsthalle Basel in Switzerland. And thank you, Elena, for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Also for this, I think one really beautiful thing about the very open-ended topic, rhythm as a dancer, which I know many of the people on the panel, we asked ourselves before we came here, like, what were we supposed to do? What does this mean exactly? And what I find so beautiful is we've all interpreted it in slightly different ways. For me, the thing that I immediately thought of, well, if rhythm is the thing that, say, gives you cues to movement or structures the possibility of dance, what would that be? What would the equivalent be for me as a curator? What could I say gives me the cues to how I think about an exhibition and what form it should take? And so I thought through some of the exhibitions that I had made in the last years. And this is less a presentation of my institution as such, or what I'm doing there, and more how through various institutions that I've been involved in, I've tried to think through what form the exhibition should take via looking closely at the problems or questions that the artworks I want to show reveal, or the ways in which they resist the very idea of being put into an exhibition. So I will take you through some images of the exhibition's 3 examples. And there's many images. I won't speak to each one of them, but I will just let them sort of be the backdrop. I could refer perhaps to the first of these exhibitions would be a show I did at Wheels in 2010, a Felix González Torres retrospective. In fact, it was the very first exhibition I did as a new curator at that institution, which itself was a relatively new institution. My director asked me to curate the show, a retrospective of Felix González Torres, as my first task as new curator. And I was thrilled by the opportunity. Felix González Torres is an artist I admire tremendously. And as soon as I began sort of researching, thinking about plunging into the work, reading every interview I could read of the artist, every essay I could possibly find on him, because I was by no means an expert, just a passionate amateur of his work, I came back to my director after a few weeks, and I thanked him for the incredible trust he had placed in me and the opportunity to make a retrospective of this fine artist. But I said I didn't think we should do a retrospective of Felix González Torres' work, quite simply. I thought that what I'd understood in my reading was that maybe the very central problem that Felix had left for us, the question, the legacy that he'd left for artists afterwards, the reason why he had been so influential is not simply because of the form that his works took, the candy piles, the paper stacks, but a fundamental questioning of authority that was kind of inherent in each and one of his works, his ways of thinking. In various lectures that you might have heard of him, he would often begin a lecture by talking about the dictionary, that most unobtrusive piece of writing, a tool even, neutral, you would think. And he would insist in his lectures that the dictionary was written by someone from some place, of some gender, of some nationality, of some age, and all of these things mattered. All of these things inflected how it was written. When he would teach his students photography class, the very first lesson he would give them would be to go home and come back with an article from the New York Times that they could show to be untrue or false. Through many such stories, anecdotes they might seem, I understood that this questioning of authority was very central to how he thought about the artwork, to how he thought about the exhibitions he made. After all, if he left the form of a paper pile or a candy pile completely open to the visitors that might touch and take and deform them over time, he was fundamentally questioning the possibility that the artist was the ultimate giver of an authoritative form, that the object itself could be undone, its form too could be questioned, and even the institution that had to shift its rules because people could suddenly touch and take and eat on the premises. All these things were the background to my deciding one should not do a retrospective, which my director very kindly nodded and said he understood very well what I meant, and that was very interesting, but I would do the retrospective that I was hired to do. And I went back to the drawing board, and I did this dance with him, speak of rhythm, twice, because I went back to the reading and looking at the work, and I was really convinced. And so the second time I went back to my director, I had two other options, other artists that I thought we should do a retrospective of, but it wasn't that the retrospective as such shouldn't happen. It was a retrospective of Felix González Torres that I thought was problematic. And he left me, my director, with the task, because again, he nodded, and again, he said I would do that retrospective. He left me with the task of finding a form that would be appropriate to this idea that I felt was so central to the work, that it needed to be an exhibition that should itself not have any authority. Because if you would do a retrospective of Felix González Torres, it should be one that doesn't become an authority in itself, that doesn't say these 40 works in this particular order are the story, the history of Felix González Torres. The pictures you're looking at now, and thank you, João, are versions of the show I curated, the beginning of the retrospective of Felix González Torres. I did make a selection of works that I thought personally, because in curating, as we've seen, and as we probably know, it's an extremely subjective enterprise, despite what some people may think, or the kind of institutional literature sometimes makes you feel as if a selection, a history, couldn't have been told otherwise. But in fact, I think it always could have been told otherwise, and that was the point, and that was the lesson maybe that Felix left. So in order to do the retrospective, in order to make one that would not have its own authority, that would undo it, I did the only thing I could think of to do. I started talking to artists who had been, in their own practice, influenced by Felix's work. And in talking to them, I understood that maybe that was my way out, that was maybe, or my way in, depending how you look at it. I could ask artists to co-curate the exhibition with me, and in the process not make one exhibition that would be definitive, that would be authoritative, but rather make 6 exhibitions. In order to do that, I I decided at every venue where the exhibition was held, and it was held at 3 venues, the first being Wheels, where I was curator at the time, I would put up a show, my version of how I thought a retrospective of Felix González Torres could look. And I asked an artist who had been influenced by his practice, and in this case, at Wheels, I asked Jan Vo to take down my show halfway through the duration, and then install his own version of what he thought the retrospective of Felix González Torres should look like. In the case of Jan Vo's version, it was extremely minimal. I had had about 50 works of Felix in my show. Jan had 18 pieces. So it was a much more minimal version. He was not obliged to use works that I had shown in my version. It was a complete carte blanche for the checklist. Even how he made the wall labels was completely different. And when Jan Vo proposed to engrave his wall labels with the captions, with the floor plans, in brass plaques that would be attached to the wall, always at the end of the exhibition, never at the beginning, I understood that the thing that I thought was so obvious and neutral, like, Helvetica, 12-point, on white carton at the beginning next to a work, that this too was a completely subjective choice. And the fact that Jan Vo thought it could be brass, it could be engraved, it could be something that actually lasts forever, whereas a label normally doesn't, gets thrown away, that is not a work, it's not a work by Jan, it is the label for the show, and that it should always come after the works, so that first you experience the work itself, and only at the end of the show do you get the information about the size, the dimension, the year, the title, etc. I had hung my light strings in the way that, probably repeating something that I had seen in many of the pictures of the way Felix himself had also shown the light strings. And this was one of the things that I thought was so problematic about Felix's work, was that there is a catalogue raisonné, and for the catalogue raisonné there's always one picture of how each piece sort of looks, except if you work with the work of Felix González Torres, if you have to install one of his shows, if you buy a piece, you're a collector of his work, you will realize the pieces often come with a contract, and the contract gives the responsibility for the form to the person installing, to the person who owns the work, to the person who is temporarily lent the piece. And in this contract, in this responsibility, is a total openness about how the works could be shown. This was one of the things that really motivated me to thinking that it had to be an exhibition that showed Felix's work in several ways, not just one. Otherwise, one version would suggest that that was the way, the authoritative way to show the work. So Jan put his on the floor. The one candy pile he showed in the whole exhibition was at the, outside the show itself, on a vertiginous fall 5 floors down from the exhibition. Maybe the most radical gesture Jan made in his version was to decide that the one public sculpture that Felix González Torres made, a light string called America, untitled America, which is meant to be in public space. He decided, after we went through town to try to figure out which space, under which bridge, or in what courtyard, or posh neighborhood or disenfranchised neighborhood it should be shown. He finally decided that he wanted to hang it in front of the house, literally hanging in front of the bedroom window of the technician that built the light string. Because each time you show the work, a local installer kind of can build the piece, a manifestation of it. And this was a kind of gift for that person who had been so involved. It was indeed in public, but I should say it was 1 hour outside of the institution, in a village that, had no public transport to get there. We'd used public money to install this in a, you could say, semi-public place, but it so beautifully understood this tension between public and private, which is at the very core of Felix's thinking. And now I'm going to go very through. You've understood the concept that each time, at each institution, there are 2 versions of the show. At the Fundación Baylor, the second venue, I did a version. And I had the great luxury of being able to install the work within the permanent collection of the Fundación Baylor. And here you see sort of different curatorial choices I made. But then I invited Carol Bove, an artist who herself had admitted that she'd been very influenced by Felix's work, to reinstall, again, take down my show, do a different version. And she did this very beautiful, very subtle gesture of, in fact, leaving in the upstairs space every work that I had shown. She left it where it was, but she made very subtle changes to it. And importantly, she took care of. These are beads cut from the length of this golden curtain, because every day that the curtain is hung, most people don't know that, but it slowly sort of begins to pull at the string and begins to touch the ground. And the one rule for the piece is that it should just float just above the ground. It should invite the passage of a person through it. And so she was there every day to cut the beads to make sure they didn't touch the ground, to straighten up the paper piles, to change the heights of the different piles. Because one thing you might know if you'd seen a contract of Felix González Torres's work is it is the responsibility of the person also to decide on the dimensions, the height, the weight. Certain things are given as an ideal or as an approximate possibility, but they're just that, they're possibilities. And it is the choice of each person to be able to, installing it, to be able to make a decision about how it's shown. I've skipped a whole part of her exhibition, but I think I'm going to far supersede my 10 minutes 20 minutes. So I'm just going to quickly take you through the different versions of the show. Again, my version. Here in this case, I already could see that my understanding of the work, my curating, was itself shifting through the influence of working so closely with artists who themselves took incredible liberties. So in this case, I hung untitled Lover Boys, this blue curtain of Felix's, in a private apartment across the street from the exhibition, where you could see it from the space of the exhibition. The twin clocks that are so iconic images of Felix's work, two clocks that touch each other, that I'd always understood through a very romantic interpretation of the piece, Untitled Lover Boys in this case also, as being about love, about a relationship. In the case of these two clocks, they're set to the exact same time at the beginning of the exhibition, and very slowly over the course of the exhibition they come a bit out of sync, and one might even die, as it were, before the other if the battery goes out. They're cheap Chinese clocks by definition. But one thing that I didn't realize when I was organizing this exhibition, it only really happened at the very end of the process. Looking at the two clocks, they were extremely out of sync, maybe about 6 minutes difference between them. And I suddenly reached for my phone, and I realized in that moment I was trying to figure out what time it was, because I thought, if these two clocks are so far off, I don't know which is right. And in that very moment I understood that that was the story of the whole show. It was the story of Felix's entire life work, to give you to tell you there is no authority that you can count on. Even the clock, the thing that you think is telling you time, even that is based on a whole set of subjective and other factors that come into play. So here you see my show, rather conventional as it were. Every time a very different interpretation of Felix's work, but nothing quite prepared me for the very end. Tino Segal, who I invited to, again, take down my show, reinstall it differently. And in his case, he made a show where he decided throughout the entire run of the exhibition, it would be 6 shows. So he curated and made plans for 6 different versions of the exhibition, and he hired students from the Städelschule to be installers, and they were installing and deinstalling each one of the 6 versions of his show during the opening hours of the exhibition. It was a Tino Segal piece in a way, but he would say, and that's the reason I can show photographs of it, it's Tino Segal curating Felix González Torres and taking this idea of possibility, of mutability, at the very central ideas of Felix's work, taking them quite literally. And here you see visitors in the exhibition coming through the show. Here's one room to give you an idea of how it changed over the course of the day in very different constellations. And this was going in a loop, so it was always happening over the opening hours of the exhibition. Now I'm going to quickly take you through 2 other shows, but what you'll understand as a kind of leitmotif or a connection between them is in each case I was really struggling to find a form for the exhibition that came from or emerged from an understanding of the work itself. In this case, Anne-Therese de Keersmaeker, a Belgian choreographer, kind of Belgian national hero of contemporary dance. And I invited her to do an exhibition at the very moment when indeed dance was becoming more and more a part of institutional vocabulary. We worked for 3 years on this project, so I invited her in 2012. And I knew from the start that the incredible rigor that is geometry and the question of live music, which is at the core of every one of her performances, needed to somehow be represented. And so I kind of gave her the preposterous proposal that we would make a show of her work, but we would not show any element of documentation. There would be no photos, no film, no sketches, no kind of scripts of her pieces, but we would try to show her work, which is her dance. And how do you do that? We took 3 years to find the answer and for her to choreograph the answer. And the answer was to take exactly the geometry. It was at the very core of her thinking and process, to inscribe it on the museum, the institutional floors. And she scripted a 9-week version of a piece that she had first realized and was realizing at the moment we were working on this project for stage. So the stage version takes 1 hour. The version at the institution took 9 weeks. It was a cast, several casts of dancers, live musicians that had stretched the piece so radically that it was live from 11 a.m. when the institution opened until 6 p.m. when it closed, every single day with dancers and musicians playing this piece, Vortex Temporum, live. We couldn't have anticipated the crowds. We couldn't have anticipated the reaction. We also couldn't have anticipated that a public would stay on average of about 4 hours per viewing, and some returned again and again. So the question of rhythm and time are very present here. And then lastly, an exhibition which was my very first project, my inaugural project as new director at Kunsthalle Basel, is a retrospective. So the retrospective has still been very much on my mind, but in this case, it's called Ongoing Retrospective, and it's a young artist, Jana Ivanova, Bulgarian, who I invited to begin her retrospective at the moment that I was beginning as director as Kunsthalle Basel, and for the entire duration of my tenure as director, she would have an open invitation to stage her retrospective. She's a performance artist, and the reason I came to this very particular sort of idea for her show is again a response to a problem or something in the work itself. As a performance artist, someone who was not trained as an artist, but who was actually trained in linguistics and worked for many years for the police translating, she's developed a performative practice that where it's all about very subtle kind of human interaction that she stages about gender and power and attraction and rivalry that's being staged in her performances. And looking at the work that she had made in the last few years, I understood that everything she was doing was about revealing sort of the unwritten codes of or structures of society. The things that you don't talk about but are actually there and structure our existence. And very many of her scripts and very many of her pieces are set in the future tense. So I asked myself, how does one make an exhibition of someone who, first of all, works on performance, who makes work which is all about revealing the codes and structures of something, and is in the future tense? I thought, as a rule for myself as a curator, what if I took that parameter exactly? And I decided to conceive what would it mean to make an exhibition that reveals the codes and the structures of exhibition making, and what would it mean to make an exhibition in the future tense. And so after some time of dialogue with her, I invited her to think about, although she's a young artist, not an older one looking back at a career of highlights and masterpieces, to look forward and for us to discuss and decide in the next, I don't know, my predecessor was at Kunsthalle Basel for 11 years, so maybe I'll be there 11 years, over the next 11 years, for her to look at her work as she's making it and to look at her past work. Basically, her first performance is from 2007, and to think about what belongs in the retrospective. And whenever she feels ready to stage it, we stage it at Kunsthalle Basel. The first exhibition happened when I arrived, and the second, and I didn't bring any pictures of it, I just wanted, in a way, to show a bit her protocol and her work. And the second just opened 2 weeks ago, the second chapter of her ongoing retrospective. And we're already now planning the third. For her second chapter, she showed her very first performance piece ever. And for her third chapter, we'll probably produce a new piece, which she feels is kind of important enough for her to enter into the retrospective. But in each case, I tried to take, and you can't do this with every exhibition or with every artist. Not every work demands it, but sometimes there is something in a body of work that asks of you that you find a form that takes its lessons or its cues, its rhythm from the work itself. And that was the case for these 3 projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. And now, last but not least, we have Vincent Honoré. And Vincent is the director of David Roberts Art Foundation in London. Oh, and Vincent is going to show a video, so we're going to switch to the other computer.
Hola. And that's it for my Spanish, I'm afraid. My name is Vincent Honoré. I'm the director of the David Roberts Art Foundation in London. Before that, I was working at the Palais de Tokyo, an contemporary art center in Paris. And after that, I moved to London to work at the Tate Modern, a museum in London. And I was asked in 2007 to conceive and to create a foundation, which is the David Roberts Art Foundation, and to create the structure of production, but as well the programs. Thinking about the rhythm as a dancer, I thought about draft as a structure more than its programs, more than a specific exhibition, and why I was invited, and how maybe rhythm could inform the structure of the institution. There's no video. So I guess I should explain what is David Roberts Art Foundation. It's a privately funded institution, but it's not a private museum, it's a charity. And we are focused on 3 main missions. The first one is research, by inviting guest curators, for instance. The second one is subjectivity, and the third one is performativity. Most of the exhibitions are moving, changing, and we cannot... And when I was asked to create and to think about David Roberts Art Foundation as a structure, I think a model that really triggered my attention was the classroom. The model of the classroom as a hybrid space where at the same time a classroom is a theater, a gallery, a studio and a cinema, in a way that all these functions interact together and sometimes merge. And I wanted the foundation to be as well hybrid. I need to help him.
You need to tell me what you want to show.
So then you can see the website, so you can sign it for the newsletter, which is good. We need to go. It's a bit chaotic, but that's fine. We need to go in 2013. It's such a mess, huh? My website is such a mess, I even can't see. Okay. I'll click. That may help us to understand the way that we operate exhibitions. Another thing that really influenced me in the conception of the foundation was a quote by Paul Oldengraber, who is a curator of the New York Public Library. I guess you all know this very big building. And he said once, imagine the building and how heavy it is, at the books, at the furniture, at the people. Imagine how heavy it is. I want the building to dance, make a heavy institution levitate, make it dance. We have ideas we need to animate. A third influence for me to create Draft was the model of the studio, especially the Arte studio. And I wanted the institution to be a factory or prototype, meaning that everything we would produce would not necessarily be a final product, but would be a prototype full of potentiality, more an introduction to something more than a conclusion. After testing the program for, I'm reading my notes because I'm not as professional as my colleagues and I always forget what I have to say. After a few years of programming in the institution, we realized that we achieved to define a few principles for what we would do. The first thing is that the institution would be a process, an organism, and it would not be a fixed product. The exhibition would not be an accumulation of objects, but they would be a research in themselves, a form in themselves. The exhibition would not be a fixed entity, but an evolving context, a site where things would happen. We would leave the institution to become a site, a scenario, a landscape, or why not a club sometimes. And we would welcome the unpredictable. I guess the conclusion of that is that at Draft we work more with time than with space. But at the core of it, I think we have the artworks. And we consider always the artwork as being a system, meaning a sort of crystal image merging different temporalities, past and future. Maybe something akin to a musical instrument, and here I'm quoting John Cage, who said when he was creating exhibition that we could treat artworks as musical instruments. The institution as well will be creating stories more than history, as Elena said, and would welcome multiple narratives in its structure. French writer Maurice Blanchot had this quote, "Dance is the form and the movement of inspiration." In that sense, it comes close to what Pina Bausch said about dance as a pure presence to oneself, a co-presence to the world. And I believe that maybe what we tend to achieve at Draft is to create an institution and a series of exhibitions where the exhibitions would be themselves pure presence, pure co-presence, and would trigger a sort of musical state of mind. And I'm quoting here Debussy, who said that we should always be in a musical state of mind. I'm quoting a lot of people who had been influencing me in the creation of the space and of the programming of Draft. I guess the exhibition as a pure co-presence is a subjective experience, but a shared one, akin to dance. What we do as well at Draft is that we have different temporalities of programming all the time. The first one are permanent installations. I asked a group of artists, and it's an ongoing project, to inhabit the building itself. So we had, for instance, Laurence Wiener, who reenacted a piece from '68. The next one will be Danish artist Nina Bayer, who will be a series of works and tiles in the toilets at the foundation. We had a quote by Louis Kamitzer on the facade. Martin Boyce created a series of fake ventilation grids all around the space. They are very discrete interventions, but they inhabit the space at all times, so the space is at all time a museum, even if we are installing or deinstalling an exhibition. The second one are the exhibitions and the projects. We do 4 exhibitions. We have 4 seasons a year, lasting about 3 months. And the last one are the more ephemeral projects, especially performances and education. We do a lot of performances at Draft, and what you are seeing here is an evening of performances we staged in 2013. So you saw the exhibition being deinstalled, and it's already the moment where the building itself become performative. And when we invited choreographer Florence Peake to do a dance piece, then British artist Juliette Blightman did a happening, Michael Dean did another happening, and we ended up with Kim Gordon from Sonic Youth. So my accent, Sonic Youth. Say it.
Sonic Youth.
Yeah. Playing with Rodney Graham at Draft. What we do is that we usually as well, we don't host things, we create and reproduce things with the artist. For instance, Sarah Lucas did a piece for us and it was her first performance at Draft. We try to do to really be closer to the production than to the exhibition. We really want the building, which is an old factory for furniture, to remain a factory of thoughts and a factory of movements. So these three temporalities, long-term, medium-term, and very ephemeral, cohabit in the building at all time. And I guess it creates different rhythms inside the exhibition, the institution, and it inscribes different kind of memories in the viewers and as well, I guess, in the team. It creates as well a sort of choreographed museum, and possibly someone who really influenced me in that sense is Christian Bernard, who was the director of the MAMCO in Geneva. I don't know if you know this institution. It's remarkable in the way that he really played it as almost an instrument, with each room having a different scenario, with each thinking of the exhibition as a repertoire, so he could play them 10 years after, replay them. It's a fantastic way of creating an institution which is always dynamic. Pina Bausch said that I am not interested why people dance, but how they dance, which is very good for me. I'm a very terrible dancer, that's why I like this quote. And I guess I'm not really interested why we do exhibition, but how we do exhibition. And I'm not very much interested in why you are seeing exhibition, but how you are experiencing exhibition in that particular building, which is DRAF. I guess the goal of activating DRAF as a sort of a choreographed museum or stage museum is to enable the site and its production as a shared being, as a co-presence between the audience, the producers, artists, writers, curators, and the team, and the context. I guess it's about trying to formulate a sense of communality, I would say, the director of the Reina Sofia in Madrid. Close maybe to the emotional architecture of Matthias Goeritz, where we are really in a co-presence with the building and the time in the building, which is what Le Corbusier was saying. You know, Le Corbusier was saying that architecture is not about space, it's about time. And I guess Barragan would say that architecture is not about space, it's about light. So, I guess how Rhythm at Infused DRAF was about and is about to create a shared community inside the building, so we could think together and experience together the artwork and its production and the experience of the art. And then I will show you a last video which gather everything I said, research, because we invited last year, a guest curator called Christine Eyene. She's coming from Cameroon. And she created, we need to go back to the, and this time, she created an exhibition which was about African rhythm and its legacy from John Cage onward into contemporary art. And that was a research that was never done before. And no. Which year? 2015? Yeah. And it sort of encapsulates everything I just said about DRAF. It's only 2 minutes. I'm so not post-internet. Which one? I'm pre-fax. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for the presentations. I think it was very interesting for us when we thought about the panel. We were thinking of how you would respond to this idea of rhythm as a dancer, not in a very direct way, but how that could translate into how you think of curating, how you think of exhibition making, or how you even think of commissioning and working directly with artists. And while you were all speaking, I suddenly realized that maybe rhythm isn't a dancer, maybe rhythm is literally change. Because in a way or another, all of you thought of change and how change feeds into your practice, and change in a very direct way, either thinking in terms of how do you think about what an exhibition is or can be in relation to the audience or in relation to the artistic practice that you're working with. So I was wondering if change can be the rhythm within your own practice. I don't know, I was just curious about that. Okay. Fine. So maybe we should open up to the audience because you don't want to answer my question. So are there any questions? None?
I could say that, change is always something that you have to, is it Fischler and Weiss who say you have to accept it as inevitable, I think, whether you like it or not. But I would just want to point out that in the first scenario, if you remember, I spoke about these 4 scenarios for the future, and the first was continuity. Continuity doesn't mean there's no change. So this is one possible way of answering your question. And so the slow rhythm that you're talking about is change, but it's happening slowly enough not to be immediately seen as change, perhaps. And collapse is, of course, another way of looking at change that doesn't have to be necessarily only negative also. So you could turn everything around using this notion of change, obviously, yes.
To that, I could also say that one really interesting thing that I also noted so well when everyone was speaking, that we had each of our different positions, but there seemed a desire in each of our descriptions of projects we'd done, or institutions we shaped, or institutions we'd worked for, or passed through, a desire to shift the possibility for how they are conventionally thought, whether we're slightly pushing at the walls of what an exhibition is or can be, or the time that's expected an exhibition to be, or the kinds of things that one might think a private foundation that is an institution should do, or what the future looks like, or how the differences between going from a Kunsthalle situation to a museum situation. That really moves me very much, that I could be very proud to be on a panel with colleagues who were very much invested in this idea of not leaving things as they are or accepting them unquestioned, but trying to think through what they are, what they have been, and what they can still yet be.
No, yeah, it's interesting how rhythm ended up being about that in this panel, which, as you probably know, is something that is very dear to us, since we run this project called Kunsthalle Lissabon in Lisbon, and institutional reflection or imagination as a way of thinking about institutions has been at the core of our practice. So I was just wondering if this wasn't a very kind of secret way of starting to talk about these things in this panel. So it was very curious how everyone was addressing these issues of kind of testing, pushing the limits, reimagining, reconfiguring not only the institutions, but the exhibition as a format or as a rhetorical device, or even artistic practice. So maybe this is where our rhythm is. So I don't know.
I'm curious, when I was sitting here, I don't know if you were invited because you're all from different places, or that was coincidence, or...
We've invited people that we thought had something interesting to contribute to this idea of rhythm in an unexpected way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's serendipitous that you guys are all working in different areas. But on top of that, most of you aren't working in the countries that you were born from, I don't think. I'm not sure about you, and Yilmaz, it's sort of half and half. And so I guess what I want to get to is, I'm a big fan of regionalism. I think it's globalization thing seems a bit nuts to me. So because you all bring very different experiences to your new working environments, do you think that's helpful?
Do I think it's helpful? Probably. It's also complicated.
Yeah.
I've lived in Rome for 15 years, and I never expected to be in Rome for 15 years. But I'm there, and I run an institution. I'm the only non-Italian curator working in Rome, running a foundation, which is an institution. So I have a flexibility, I have a responsibility, and I can assume a position that I can both look from the outside and look from the inside. And I feel very much like I'm looking from the outside and looking from the inside. I think when I talk about slowness as a sort of a curatorial position, or as sort of embracing slowness, I'm responding to Rome. And I'm responding to a very sort of delayed sense of time in Rome. But it's also a way of responding to very contemporary Rome, which is frenetic and exhaustive and exhausting, and very much about the event and the moment. And so, everyone loves to be somewhere, but then it's really hard to kind of develop a relationship where they'll come back and they'll sit. And I really want some people to come back and sit with work. So yeah, I think it's obvious that we're always moving in and out of our own cultural experience and our own cultural background, and
yeah, I think you pointed out an important question, I would describe regionalism as a way to approach not only an international audience, but also a local audience, and not only approach, but also how to involve them. And we've seen different examples of this. That's, for example, why we did in Bregenz with Yvonne Rayner, to involve the local dance community. But I think it's also, it is a challenge, how to, for example, in Bregenz it was much more difficult than in Hamburg, where there is the academy, where there is a audience which per se has a lot of, interest in what we do. And I think to create this awareness of the practice of the institution is a challenge, and that's what I would call a positive regionalism.
If you look at the country where I'm living and working, Belgium, it is actually one of the more generous countries in Europe, I think, in terms of accepting curators from abroad. If you look at the handful of institutions I can think of now, I myself am Swedish, but also Lithuanian in a way. So my colleague in the museum is English Pakistani, and the curator in Ghent is German. There are two other institutions in Antwerp, and one used to be run until recently by a Romanian, and the other one by a Swiss-Canadian curator. And finally there, your successor at Wales is English, who has also worked in the Netherlands. That tells you something about a place on the map which in itself, in many ways, is a pocket of provinciality in the center of Europe. It is, but it's at the same time quite open to this. And it is hard today to name another country in Europe that would be more open to this particular profession, in terms of people from other countries. I can't think of any at this point. The Netherlands used to be that other example, but it's kind of closing in on itself a bit, I think. Switzerland, maybe.
It's hard for me to. I'm American by birth, and yes, have. But the Kunsthalle, for instance, has a long history of employing non-Swiss curators, and is an extremely kind of open place. You know, there are so many ways of thinking of these questions. I'm also the first female director of a 175-year-old institution. So it's their regionalism, you know, gender issues, all of these, provincialism, internationalism, all mixed together. But I would say that it's also a place that is, I mean, I should say Switzerland also only gave women the vote in the 1970s. So it's a very particular place. But whereas it had been very closed about certain things, it was open about others.
Not sure about regionalism in London, but having said so, I think it's very important for as a curator to cast new eyes on some practices. And for instance, I've been working with people like Bruce MacLean or Stuart Brisley, who are very important performance artists from the UK, and to my mind had been a little bit underrated in our own country. And it was a privilege for me to discover their work, maybe, and then to really research their work in depth and have this French maybe eyes on these works and rediscover certain kind of part of the practice. Same with the Boyle family, who is a very important collective from the 70s in London. They were the one who did the first sound and light environment with the Pink Floyd in Camden in the 70s. Mark, another question.
No, that's great. I think things have changed a lot in the past 10 years. I think up until then, it had been the curators were from the places that they were working, and I think that it's hard to see outside of that. I think so when different kinds of people come in, they can see it more clearly. I think, like what needs to change.
No, sorry. Sorry. I just want to say that there's this quite interesting way of looking at the migrant or the person who migrates from place to place, and also to see that in terms of time. There's a quite interesting emigre Jewish Russian writer whose name is Zinovy, and he lives in London. For many years he lives there. And he made many enemies in the Jewish community worldwide, and also in Moscow and also in London, when he, in a lecture said, and in a text said, that what really makes us, as the itinerant, Jewish community, intellectual community, special, is that we have developed the skill of stealing other people's history throughout our own history. It's not about assimilation, really. It's more than that. It's taken something from the environment where you are temporarily or permanently transplanted and making it your own. And I think somehow, at least in my own practice, as somebody who's also moved around a bit, I can see what he means. I wouldn't necessarily subscribe to. I mean, it's provocative what he says in terms of the Jewish community, but I think he has a point. Also relating to maybe to us here. Who have also identified perhaps with more than one place, with more than one culture, more than one language also, And when you do that, you sort of develop, maybe it's even a skill, to take things from the environment where you are and reformulate them and throw them back at the environment in a different way, so perhaps that the environment can see itself with new eyes. I mean, I personally have done this a few times quite consciously when I've been invited to look at a regional situation. In Europe there are also regional biennials where somebody is asked from the outside to look at the scene in a particular place. And when you do that, you hopefully add something new, but not by actually connecting to other places, but you're doing what you are doing, going back in time in the place where you have landed and try to find things that people have overlooked, perhaps, And that's another way of connecting place and time in the curatorial profession.
I just wanted to bring up, based on what you have been saying, that here in Mexico, and I think it's the case for a lot of Latin America, we don't have a lot of immigrant curators or people who are in high places in the art world. We sort of do subscribe to that regionalism, and I wanted to know if anyone has any comments on what you have been talking about in Europe, but applied to Mexico or Latin America? Or not?
I mean, I can say that I spoke to a colleague yesterday who is here in Mexico, and she said that, you know, one of the reasons that people don't necessarily take jobs in organizations here as curators is that it doesn't mean the same thing here as it does in Europe, you know, in terms of the conditions you're offered, and also in terms of how much you can influence, I suppose, the policy of the organization, you know. So maybe there's something structural, you know, which is not to do with provincialism or regionalism, but more to do with political structure, that makes institutions in this particular part of the world less able to accommodate people with ideas from, you know, even from a neighboring country where you speak the same language. Because you have this, you know, you have the Spanish or Portuñol, whatever, community here, which makes it really possible for you to change location, but then you have the structures that make it less possible, perhaps. But there are some examples. I mean, you have Teoretica, for instance, in San Jose, in Costa Rica, an organization that has been directed by a Colombian and now by a Peruvian, you know, which sort of indicates that this is changing, I suppose. And you have a Colombian director of Tamayo, and, you know, you have these things happening. So it's good. And you also, of course, have artists who go through different stages in their development, studying, working, and I suppose also, you know, substituting, you know, Mexico City for Quito or Buenos Aires for Santiago, maybe, you know. I'm not aware of the extent to which this is happening, but I do believe it is happening. So.
No, but I would completely agree. And I mean, the Tamayo is a good example. There is not only a Colombian director, but a new Ecuadorian curator. There's Chris Sharp, an American, running an artist-run space, and there are many more that I probably don't know about. But if these are relatively new developments, then it is signs that things are changing.
Another important thing as well is that you have amazing Mexican curators around the world. I would just name Pablo León de la Barra or Magali Arriola, who are doing extraordinary projects around the world. Maybe sometimes bringing some Mexican artists we don't know, which is absolutely crucial. And Sofia Hernandez.
So, thank you so much for the conversation. Thank you to all of you, and thank you to